Chapter 78 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 78. Restoration. The same afternoon, while Donal was reading to Arctura in the library, there came a loud ringing of the doorbell. Donal ran to see, and to his great delight, there was Mistress Brookes, half wild with anxious terror. "Is my lady safe?" she cried, then clasped Donal in her arms and embraced him as if he had been her son. From the moment she discovered herself fooled, she had been imagining all manner of terrible things, yet none so terrible as the truth. There was no end to her objurgations, exclamations, anathemas, and interjections. "Now I can leave you in peace, my lady," said Donal, who had not resumed his seat. "No, ye can bide where ye are, and be thankful," said Mistress Brookes. "Who daur meddle wi' ye, and me in the hoose? And who kens what the mad yerl, for mad I shall uphold him, and fit only to be locked up, who kens what he may do next? Maister Grant, I canna let ye oot o' the house." "I was only going as far as Mistress Comin's," replied Donal. "Weel, ye can gang, but mind ye're home in good time." "I thought of putting up there, but I will do as my lady pleases." "Come home," said Arctura. Donal went, and the first person he saw when he entered the house was Eppy. She turned instantly away and left the room. He could not help seeing why. The old woman welcomed him with her usual cordiality, but not her usual cheerfulness. He had scarcely noted since her husband's death any change on her manner till now. She looked weary of the world. She sat down, smoothed her apron on her knees, gave him one glance in the face, then looked down at her hands, and said nothing. "I ken what ails ye, Doory," said Donal, "but in the name o' him 'at's awa', hearken till me. The lass is no lost, neither is the Lord asleep. Yer lamb's been sair misguided, sair pluckit o' her bonnie wool; but gien for that she haud the closer by the Lord's flock, she'll ken it wasna for want o' his care the tod got a grup o' her. It's a terrible pity for the bonnie cratur, disgracin' them 'at aught her. What for winna young folk believe them 'at speaks true, but will believe them 'at tells them little but lies? Still, it's no as gien she had been stealin'. She's wronged her poor sel', an' she's wronged us a', an' she's wronged the Lord, but for a' that ye canna look doon upon her, as upon the man 'at's grown rich at the cost o' his neighbours. There's mony a gran' prood lady 'll hae to stand aside to let Eppy pass up, when we're afore the righteous judge." "Eh, but ye speak like my Anerew!" cried the poor woman, wiping her old eyes with her rough apron. "I s' do what I can for her, but there's no hidin' o' 't." "Hidin' o' 't!" cried Donal. "The Lord forbid! Sic things are no to be hidden. So long as she's in the world, the thing has to be kenned o' all 'at come nigh her. She maun beir her burden, poor lass. The Lord he'll lighten it till her, but he'll hae naething smugglet up. That's no the way o' his kingdom. I suppose there's no doubt who?" "None. The Lord forbid!" 2 days after, Mr. Graeme and his sister returned, and at lady Arctura's request took up their abode at the castle. She told them that of late she had become convinced her uncle was no longer capable of attending to her affairs, that he was gone to London, that she had gone away with him, and was supposed to be with him still, though she had returned, and he did not know where she was. She did not wish him to know, but desired for the present to remain concealed. She had her reasons, and requested therefore as a personal favour that they would not once or to any one allude to her being at the castle. Mr. Graeme would in the meantime be so good as make himself acquainted, so far as possible, with the state of affairs between her and her uncle. In the course of the investigations thereupon following, it became clear that a large portion of the moneys of the estate received by his lordship were nowise accounted for. Lady Arctura directed that further inquiry should in the meantime be stayed, but that no more money should be handed over to him. For some time the factor heard nothing from his lordship. At length came instructions as to the forwarding of money, Forgue writing and his father signing. Mr. Graeme replied, excusing himself as he could, but sending no money. They wrote again. Again he excused himself. The earl threatened. Mr. Graeme took no heed. His lordship continued to demand and threaten, but neither he nor his son appeared. The factor at length wrote that he would pay no money but to lady Arctura. The earl himself wrote in a reply, saying, had he been out of the country that he did not know she was dead and 6 weeks in her grave? Again the factor did not reply. Donal rode back to Glashgar, and brought Davy home. Lessons were resumed, and Arctura took her full share in them. Soon all about the castle was bustle and labour, masons and carpenters busy from morning to night. The wall that masked the windows of the chapel was pulled down. The windows, of stained glass with never a crack, were cleaned. The passage under them was open to the great stair. Lady Arctura had a small sweet-toned organ built in the little gallery, and the mural stair from her own room opened again, that she might go down when she pleased to play on it. Sometimes, in southeasterly winds, to listen to the aeolian harp dreaming out the music of the spheres. In the process of removing the bed, much of it crumbled to dust. The carved tester and back were set up, the one over the great chimney-piece in the hall, the other over that in Arctura's room. The altar was replaced where the bed had been. The story of the finding of the lost chapel was written by Donal, and placed by Arctura among the records of the family. But it soon became evident that what she had passed through had exercised a hurtful influence on Lady Arctura's health. She was almost always happy, but her strength at times would suddenly desert her. Both Donal and Mistress Brookes regarded her with some anxiety. Her organ, to which she gave more labour than she was quite equal to, was now one of her main delights. Often would its chords be heard creeping through the long ducts and passages of the castle. Either for a small instrument its tone was peculiarly penetrating, or the chapel was the centre of the system of the house. On the roof would Donal often sit listening to the sounds that rose through the shaft, airs and harmonies freed by her worshipping fingers, rejoicing to think how her spirit was following the sounds, guided by them in lovely search after her native country. One day she went on playing till she forgot everything but her music, and almost unconsciously began to sing, "The Lord is mindful of his own." She was unaware that she had two listeners, one on the roof above, one in the chapel below. When 12 months were come and gone since his departure, the earl one bright morning approached the door of the castle, half doubting, half believing it his own. He was determined on dismissing the factor after rigorous examination of his accounts, and he wanted to see Davy. He had driven to the stables, and thence walked out on the uppermost terrace, passing the chapel without observing its unmasked windows. The great door was standing open. He went in and up the stair, haunted by sounds of music he had been hearing ever since he stepped on the terrace. But on the stair was a door he had never seen. Who dared make changes in his house? The thing was bewildering, but he was accustomed to be bewildered. He opened the door, plainly a new one, and entered a gloomy little passage, lighted from a small aperture unfit to be called a window. The underside of the bare steps of a narrow stone stair were above his head. Had he or had he not ever seen the place before? On the right was a door. He went to it, opened it, and the hitherto muffled music burst loud on his ear. He started back in dismal apprehension. There was the chapel, wide open to the eye of day, clear and clean, gone the hideous bed, gone the damp and the dust, while the fresh air trembled with the organ breath rushing and rippling through it, and setting it in sweetest turmoil. He had never had such a peculiar experience. He had often doubted whether things were or were not projections from his own brain. He moved and acted in a world of subdued fact and enhanced fiction. He knew that sometimes he could not tell the one from the other, but never had he had the apparently real and the actually unreal brought so much face to face with each other. Everything was as clear to his eyes as in their prime of vision, and yet there could be no reality in what he saw. Ever since he left the castle, he had been greatly uncertain whether the things that seemed to have taken place there had really taken place. He got himself in doubt about them the moment he failed to find the key of the oak door. When he asked himself what then could have become of his niece, he would reply that doubtless she was all right. She did not want to marry Forgue, and had slipped out of the way. She had never cared about the property. To have her own will was all women cared about. Would his factor otherwise have dared such liberties with him, the lady's guardian? He had not yet rendered his accounts, or yielded his stewardship. When she died, the property would be his. If she was dead, it was his. She would never have dreamed of willing it away from him. She did not know she could. How should she? Girls never thought about such things. Besides, she would not have the heart. He had loved her as his own flesh and blood. At intervals, nevertheless, he was assailed, at times overwhelmed, by the partial conviction that he had starved her to death in the chapel. Then he was tormented as with all the furies of hell. In his night visions he would see her lie wasting, hear her moaning and crying in vain for help. The hardest heart is yet at the mercy of aroused imagination. He saw her body in its progressive stages of decay as the weeks passed, and longed for the process to be over that he might go back, and pretending to have just found the lost room, carry it away, and have it honourably buried. Should he take it for granted that it had lain there for centuries, or suggest it must be Lady Arctura, that she had got shut up there like the bride in the chest? If he could but find an old spring lock to put on the door! But people were so plaguy sharp nowadays, they found out everything. He could not afford to have everything found out. God himself must not be allowed to know everything. He stood staring. As he stood and stared, his mind began to change. Perhaps, after all, what he saw might be. The whole thing it had displaced must then be a fancy, a creation of the dreaming brain. God in heaven! If it could but be proven that he had never done it! All the other wicked things he was, or supposed himself, guilty of, some of them so heavy that it had never seemed of the smallest use to repent of them, all the rest might be forgiven him. But what difference would that make to the fact that he had done them? He could never take his place as a gentleman where all was known. They made such a fuss about a sin or two, that a man went and did worse out of pure despair. But if he had never murdered anybody, in that case he could almost consent there should be a God. He could almost even thank him. For what? That he was not to be damned for the thing he had not done? A thing he had had the misfortune to dream he had done, God never interfering to protect him from the horrible fancy? What was the good of a God that would not do that much for you, that left his creatures to make fools of themselves and only laughed at them? Bah! There was life in the old dog yet. If only he knew the thing for a fancy! The music ceased, and the silence was a shock to him. Again he began to stare about him. He looked up. Before him in the air hovered the pale face of the girl he had, or had not, murdered. It was one of his visions, but not therefore more unreal than any other appearance. She came from the world of his imagination, so real to him that in expectant moods it was the world into which he was to step the moment he left the body. She looked sweetly at him. She was come to forgive his sins. Was it then true? Was there no sin of murder on his soul? Was she there to assure him that he might yet hope for the world to come? He stretched out his arms to her. She turned away. He thought she had vanished. The next moment she was in the chapel, but he did not hear her, and stood gazing up. She threw her arms around him. The contact of the material startled him with such a revulsion that he uttered a cry, staggered back, and stood looking at her in worse perplexity still. He had done the awful thing, yet had not done it. He stood as one bound to know the thing that could not be. "Don't be frightened, uncle," said Arctura. "I am not dead. The sepulchre is only the resurrection house. Uncle, uncle, thank God with me." The earl stood motionless. Strange thoughts passed through him at their will. Had her presence dispelled darkness and death, and restored the lost chapel to the light of day? Had she haunted it ever since, dead yet alive, watching for his return to pardon him? Would his wife so receive him at the last with forgiveness and endearment? His eyes were fixed upon her. His lips moved tremulously once or twice, but no word came. He turned from her, glanced round the place, and said, "It is a great improvement." I wonder how it would be with souls if they waked up and found all their sins but hideous dreams. How many would loathe the sin? How many would remain capable of doing all again? But few, perhaps no burdened souls can have any idea of the power that lies in God's forgiveness to relieve their consciousness of defilement. Those who say, "Even God cannot destroy the fact," care more about their own cursed shame than their Father's blessed truth. Such will rather excuse than confess. When a man heartily confesses, leaving excuse to God, the truth makes him free. He knows that the evil has gone from him, as a man knows that he is cured of his plague. "I did the thing," he says, "but I could not do it now. I am the same, yet not the same. I confess, I would not hide it, but I loathe it, 10 times the more that the evil thing was mine." Had the earl been able to say thus, he would have felt his soul a cleansed chapel, new open to the light and air. Nay, better, a fresh-watered garden, in which the fruits of the Spirit had begun to grow. God's forgiveness is as the burst of a spring morning into the heart of winter. His autumn is the paying of the uttermost farthing. To let us go without that would be the pardon of a demon, not the forgiveness of the eternally loving God. But "not yet, alas, not yet," has to be said over so many souls. Arctura was struck dumb. She turned and walked out upon the great stair, her uncle following her. All the way up to the second floor she felt as if he were about to stab her in the back, but she would not look behind her. She went straight to her room, and heard her uncle go on to his. She rang her bell, sent for Donal, and told him what had passed. "I will go to him," said Donal. Arctura said nothing more, thus leaving the matter entirely in his hands. Donal found him lying on the couch. "My lord," he said, "you must be aware of the reasons why you should not present yourself here." The earl started up in one of his ready rages. They were real enough. With epithets of contemptuous hatred, he ordered Donal from the room and the house. Donal answered nothing till the rush of his wrath had abated. "My lord," he said, "there is nothing I would not do to serve your lordship, but I have no choice but tell you that if you do not walk out you shall be expelled." "Expelled, you dog!" "Expelled, my lord. The would-be murderer of his hostess must at least be put out of the house." "Good heavens!" cried the earl, changing his tone with an attempted laugh. "Has the poor hysterical girl succeeded in persuading a man of your sense to believe her childish fancies?" "I believe every word my lady says, my lord. I know that you had nearly murdered her." The earl caught up the poker and struck at his head. Donal avoided the blow. It fell on the marble chimney piece. While his arm was yet jarred by the impact, Donal wrenched the poker from him. "My lord," he said, "with my own hands I drew the staple of the chain that fastened her to the bed on which you left her to die. You were yet in the house when I did so." "You damned rascal, you stole the key! If it had not been for that, I should have gone to her again. I only wanted to bring her to reason." "But as you had lost the key, rather than expose your cruelty, you went away and left her to perish. You wanted her to die unless you could compel her to marry your son, that the title and property might go together, and that when with my own ears I heard your lordship tell that son that he had no right to any title." "What a man may say in a rage goes for nothing," answered the earl, sulkily rather than fiercely. "But not what a woman writes in sorrow," rejoined Donal. "I know the truth from the testimony of her you called your wife, as well as from your own mouth." "The testimony of the dead, and at second hand, will hardly be received in court," returned the earl. "If after your lordship's death the man now called lord Forgue dares assume the title of Morven, I will publish what I know. In view of that, your lordship had better furnish him with the vouchers of his mother's marriage. My lord, I again beg you to leave the house." The earl cast his eyes round the walls, as if looking for a weapon. Donal took him by the arm. "There is no farther room for ceremony," he said. "I am sorry to be rough with your lordship, but you compel me. Please remember I am the younger and the stronger man." As he spoke, he let the earl feel the ploughman's grasp. It was useless to struggle. His lordship threw himself on the couch. "I will not leave the house! I am come home to die!" he yelled. "I'm dying now, I tell you! I cannot leave the house! I have no money! Forgue has taken all!" "You owe a large sum to the estate," said Donal. "It is lost! All lost, I tell you! I have nowhere to go to! I am dying!" He looked so utterly wretched that Donal's heart smote him. He stood back a little, and gave himself time. "You would wish then to retire, my lord, I presume?" he said. "Immediately, to be rid of you," the earl answered. "I fear, my lord, if you stay, you will not soon be rid of me. Have you brought Simmons with you?" "No, damn him! He is like all the rest of you. He has left me." "I will help you to bed, my lord." "Go about your business. I will get myself to bed." "I will not leave you except in bed," rejoined Donal with decision, and ringing the bell he desired the servant to ask mistress Brookes to come to him. She came instantly. Before the earl had time even to look at her, Donal asked her to get his lordship's bed ready. If she would not mind doing it herself, he said, he would help her. He must see his lordship to bed. She looked a whole book at him, but said nothing. Donal returned her gaze with one of quiet confidence, and she understood it. What it said was, "I know what I am doing, mistress Brookes. My lady must not turn him out. I will take care of him." "What are you two whispering at there?" cried the earl. "Here I am at the point of death, and you will not even let me go to bed." "Your room will be ready in a few minutes, my lord," said Mrs. Brookes, and she and Donal went to work in earnest, but with the door open between the rooms. When it was ready, "Now, my lord," said Donal, "will you come?" "When you are gone. I will have none of your cursed help." "My lord, I am not going to leave you." With much grumbling and a very ill grace, his lordship submitted, and Donal got him to bed. "Now put that cabinet by me on the table," he said. The cabinet was that in which he kept his drugs, and had not been touched since he left it. Donal opened the window, took up the cabinet, and threw it out. With a bellow like that of a bull, the earl sprang out of bed, and just as the crash came from below, ran at Donal where he stood shutting the window, as if he would have sent him after the cabinet. Donal caught him and held him fast. "My lord," he said, "I will nurse you, serve you, do anything, everything for you, but for the devil I'll be damned if I move hand or foot. Not one drop of hellish stuff shall pass your lips while I am with you." "But I am dying! I shall die of the horrors!" shrieked the earl, struggling to get to the window, as if he might yet do something to save his precious extracts, tinctures, essences, and compounds. "We will send for the doctor," said Donal. "A very clever young fellow has come to the town since you left. Perhaps he can help you. I will do what I can to make you give your life fair play." "Come, come, none of that damned rubbish! My life is of no end of value to me. Besides, it's too late. If I were young now, with a constitution like yours and the world before me, there might be some good in a paring or two of self-denial. But you wouldn't stab your murderer for fear of the clasp knife closing on your hand. You would not fire your pistol at him for fear of its bursting and blowing your brains out. I have no desire to keep you alive, my lord, but I would give my life to let you get some of the good of this world before you pass to the next. To lengthen your life infinitely, I would not give you a single drop of any one of those cursed drugs." He rang the bell again. "You're a friendly fellow," grunted his lordship, and went back to his bed to ponder how to gain the solace of his passion. Mrs. Brookes came. "Will you please send to Mr. Avery, the new surgeon," said Donal, "and ask him in my name to come to the castle?" The earl was so ill, however, as to be doubtful, much as he desired them, whether, while rendering him for the moment less sensible to them, any of his drugs would do no other than increase his sufferings. He lay with closed eyes, a strange expression of pain mingled with something like fear every now and then passing over his face. I doubt if his conscience troubled him. It is in general those, I think, who through comparatively small sins have come to see the true nature of them, whose consciences trouble them greatly. Those who have gone from bad to worse through many years of moral decay are seldom troubled as other men, or have any bands in their death. His lordship, it is true, suffered terribly at times because of the things he had done, but it was through the medium of aroused imagination rather than aroused conscience. The former deals with consequences, the latter with the deeds themselves. He declared he would see no doctor but his old attendant Dowster, yet all the time was longing for the young man to appear. He might, who could tell, save him from the dreaded jaws of death. He came. Donal went to him. He had summoned him, he said, without his lordship's consent, but believed he would see him. The earl had been long in the habit of using narcotics and stimulants, though not alcohol, he thought. He trusted Mr. Avery would give his sanction to the entire disuse of them, for they were killing him, body and soul. To give them up at once and entirely would cost him considerable suffering, said the doctor. He knows that, and does not in the least desire to give them up. It is absolutely necessary he should be delivered from the passion. "If I am to undertake the case, it must be after my own judgment," said the doctor. "You must undertake two things, or give up the case," persisted Donal. "I may as well hear what they are." "One is, that you make his final deliverance from the habit your object. The other, that you will give no medicine into his own hands. I agree to both, but all will depend on his nurse. I will be his nurse." The doctor went to see his patient. The earl gave one glance at him, recognized firmness, and said not a word. But when he would have applied to his wrist an instrument recording in curves the motions of the pulse, he would not consent. He would have no liberties taken with him, he said. "My lord, it is but to inquire into the action of your heart," said Mr. Avery. "I'll have no spying into my heart. It acts just like other people's." The doctor put his instrument aside, and laid his finger on the pulse instead. His business was to help, not to conquer, he said to himself. If he might not do what he would do what he could. While he was with the earl, Donal found Lady Arctura, and told her all he had done. She thanked him for understanding her. End of chapter 78. Chapter 79 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 79. A Slow Transition. A dreary time followed. Sometimes the patient would lie awake half the night, howling with misery, and accusing Donal of heartless cruelty. He knew as well as he what would ease his pain and give him sleep, but not a finger would he move to save him. He was taking the meanest of revenges. What did it matter to him what became of his soul? Surely it was worse to hate as he made him hate than to swallow any amount of narcotics. "I tell you, Grant," he said once, "I was never so cruel to those I treated worst. There's nothing in the Persian hells which beat all the rest to come up to what I go through for want of my comfort. Promise to give it to me, and I will tell you where to find some." As often as Donal refused, he would break out in a torrent of curses, then lie still for a space. "How do you think you will do without it," Donal once rejoined, "when you find yourself bodiless in the other world?" "I'm not there yet. When that comes, it will be under new conditions, if not unconditioned altogether. We'll take the world we have. So, my dear boy, just go and get me what I want. There are the keys." "I dare not." "You wish to kill me." "I wouldn't keep you alive to eat opium. I have other work than that. Not a finger would I move to save a life for such a life. But I would willingly risk my own to make you able to do without it. There would be some good in that." "Oh, damn your preaching!" But the force of the habit abated a little. Now and then it seemed to return as strong as ever, but the fit went off again. His sufferings plainly decreased. The doctor, having little yet of a practice, was able to be with him several hours every day, so that Donal could lie down. As he grew better, Davy, or Mistress Brookes, or Lady Arctura would sit with him. But Donal was never farther off than the next room. The earl's madness was the worst of any, a moral madness. It could not fail to affect the brain, but had not yet put him beyond his own control. Repeatedly had Donal been on the verge of using force to restrain him, but had not yet found himself absolutely compelled to do so. Fearless of him, he postponed it always to the very last, and the last had not yet arrived. The gentle ministrations of his niece by and by seemed to touch him. He was growing to love her a little. He would smile when she came into the room, and ask her how she did. Once he sat looking at her for some time, then said, "I hope I did not hurt you much." "When?" she asked. "Then," he answered. "Oh, no, you did not hurt me much. Another time I was very cruel to your aunt. Do you think she will forgive me?" "Yes, I do." "Then you have forgiven me?" "Of course I have." "Then of course God will forgive me too." "He will, if you leave off, you know, uncle." "That's more than I can promise." "If you try, he will help you." "How can he? It is a second nature now." "He is your first nature. He can help you too by taking away the body and its nature together." "You're a fine comforter. God will help me to be good by taking away my life. A nice encouragement to try. Hadn't I better kill myself and save him the trouble?" "It's not the dying, uncle. No amount of dying would ever make one good. It might only make it less difficult to be good." "But I might after all refuse to be good. I feel sure I should. He had better let me alone." "God can do more than that to compel us to be good. A great deal more than that. Indeed, uncle, we must repent." He said no more for some minutes, then suddenly spoke again. "I suppose you mean to marry that rascal of a tutor?" he said. She started up and called Donal, but to her relief he did not answer. He was fast asleep. "He would not thank you for the suggestion, I fear," she said, sitting down again. "He is far above me." "Is there no chance for Forgue then?" "Not the smallest. I would rather have died where you left me than—" "If you love me, don't mention that!" he cried. "I was not myself. Indeed I was not. I don't know now. That is, I can't believe sometimes I ever did it." "Uncle, have you asked God to forgive you?" "I have, 1,000 times." "Then I will never speak of it again." In general, however, he was sullen, cantankerous, abusive. They were all compassionate to him, treating him like a spoiled, but not the less in reality a sickly child. Arctura thought her grandmother could not have brought him up well. More might surely have been made of him. But Arctura had him after a lifetime fertile in cause of self-reproach, had him in the net of sore sickness, at the mercy of the Spirit of God. He was a bad old child, this much only the wiser for being old, that he had found the ways of transgressors hard. One night Donal, hearing him restless, got up from the chair where he watched by him most nights, and saw him staring, but not seeing. His eyes showed that they regarded nothing material. After a moment he gave a great sigh, and his jaw fell. Donal thought he was dead. But presently he came to himself like one escaping from torture. A terrible dream was behind him, pulling at the skirts of his consciousness. "I've seen her," he said. "She's waiting for me to take me, but where I do not know. She did not look angry, but then she seldom looked angry when I was worst to her. Grant, I beg of you, don't lose sight of Davy. Make a man of him, and his mother will thank you. She was a good woman, his mother, though I did what I could to spoil her. It was no use. I never could, and that was how she kept her hold of me. If I had succeeded, there would have been an end of her power, and a genuine heir to the earldom. What a damned fool I was to let it out! Who would have been the worse? He's a heartless, unnatural rascal, though," he resumed, "and has made of me the fool I deserved to be made. His mother must see it was not my fault. I would have set things right if I could, but it was too late. And you tell me she has had a hand in letting the truth out, leaving her letters about. That's some comfort. She was always fair, and will be the less hard on me. If I could see a chance of God being half as good to me as my poor wife. She was my wife. I will say it in spite of all the priests in the stupid universe. She was my wife and deserved to be my wife, and if I had her now I would marry her because she would be foolish enough to like it, though I would not do it all the time she was alive, let her beg ever so. Where was the use of giving in when I kept her in hand so easily that way? That was it. It was not that I wanted to do her any wrong, but you should keep the lead. A man mustn't play out his last trump and lose the lead. But then you never know about dying. If I had known my poor wife was going to die, I would have done whatever she wanted. We had merry times together. It was those cursed drugs that wiled the soul out of me, and then the devil went in and took its place. There was curara in that last medicine, I'll swear. Look you here now, Grant. If there were any way of persuading God to give me a fresh lease of life, you say he hears prayer. Why shouldn't you ask him? I would make you any promise you pleased, give you any security you wanted hereafter to live a godly, righteous, and sober life. But, said Donal, suppose God, reading your heart, saw that you would go on as bad as ever, and that to leave you any longer would only be to make it the more difficult for him to do anything with you afterwards. He might give me a chance. It is hard to expect the poor fellow to be as good as he is himself." "The poor fellow was made in his image," suggested Donal. "Very poorly made, then," said the earl with a sneer. "We might as well have been made in some other body's image." Donal thought with himself. "Did you ever know a good woman, my lord?" he asked. "Know a good woman? Hundreds of them. The other sort was more to my taste. But there was my own mother. She was rather hard on my father now and then, but she was a good woman." "Suppose you had been in her image, what then?" "You would have had some respect for me." "Then she was nearer the image of God than you?" "Thousands of miles." "Did you ever know a bad woman?" "Know a bad woman? Hundreds that would take your heart's blood as you slept to make a filter with." "Then you saw a difference between such a woman and your mother?" "The one was of heaven, the other of hell. That was all the little difference." "Did you ever know a bad woman grow better?" "No, never. Stop, let me see. I did once know a woman. She was a married woman too. That made it all the worse. All the better, I mean. She took poison, in good earnest, and died. Died, sir. Died, I say, when she came to herself and knew what she had done. That was the only woman I ever knew that grew better. How long she might have gone on better if she hadn't taken the poison, I can't tell. That fixed her good, you see." "If she had gone on, she might have got as good as your mother?" "Oh, hang it! No, I did not say that." "I mean with God teaching her all the time. For 10,000 years, say, and she always doing what he told her." "Oh, well, I don't know anything about that. I don't know what God had to do with my mother being so good. She was none of your canting sort." "There is an old story," said Donal, "of a man who was the very image of God, and ever so much better than the best of women." "He couldn't have been much of a man, then." "Were you ever afraid, my lord?" "Yes, several times. Many a time." "That man never knew what fear was." "By Jove!" "His mother was good, and he was better. Your mother was good, and you are worse. Whose fault is that?" "My own. I'm not ashamed to confess it." "Would to God you were," said Donal. "You shame your mother in being worse than she was. You were made in the image of God, but you don't look like him now any more than you look like your mother. I have a father and mother, my lord, as like God as they can look." Of course, of course. In their position there are no such temptations as in ours." "I am sure of one thing, my lord, that you will never be at any peace until you begin to show the image in which you were made. By that time you will care for nothing so much as that he should have his way with you in the whole world." "It will be long before I come to that." "Probably, but you will never have a moment's peace till you begin. It is no use talking, though. God has not made you miserable enough yet." "I am more miserable than you can think." "Why don't you cry to him to deliver you?" "I would kill myself if it weren't for one thing." "It is from yourself he would deliver you." I would, but that I want to put off seeing my wife as long as I can. I thought you wanted to see her. I long for her sometimes more than tongue can tell. And you don't want to see her? Not yet. Not just yet. I should like to be a little better. To do something or other, I don't know what, first. I doubt if she would touch me now, with that small, firm hand she would catch hold of me with when I hurt her. By Jove, if she had been a man, she would have made her mark in the world. She had a will and a way with her. If it hadn't been that she loved me. Me! Do you hear, you dog? Though there's nobody left to care a worm-eaten nut about me, it makes me proud as Lucifer merely to think of it. I don't care if there's never another to love me to all eternity. I have been loved as never man was loved. All for my own sake, mind you. In the way of money I was no great catch, and for the rank she never got any good of that, nor would if she had lived till I was earl. She had a conscience, which I never had, and would never have consented to be called countess. It will be no worse than passing for my wife now, I would say. What's either but an appearance? What's anything of all the damned humbug but appearance? One appearance is as good as another appearance. She would only smile. Smile fit to make a mule sad. And then when her baby was dying, and she wanted me to take her for a minute, and I wouldn't, she laid her down and got what she wanted herself. And when she went to take the child again, the absurd little thing was gone. Dead, I mean, gone dead, never to cry any more. There it lay motionless like a lump of white clay. She looked at me, and never, in this world, smiled again. Nor cried either, all I could do to make her. The wretched man burst into tears, and the heart of Donal gave a leap for joy. Common as tears are, fall as they may for the foolishest things, they may yet be such as to cause joy in paradise. The man himself may not know why he weeps, and his tears yet indicate his turning on his road. The earl was as far from a good man as man well could be. There were millions of spiritual miles betwixt him and the image of God. He had wept, it was hard to say at what. Not at his own cruelty, not at his wife's suffering, not in pity of the little soul that went away at last out of no human embrace. Himself least of all could have told why he wept. Yet was that weeping some sign of contact between his human soul and the great human soul of God. It was the beginning of a possible communion with the Father of all. Surely God saw this, and knew the heart he had made, saw the flax smoking yet. He who will not let us out until we have paid the uttermost farthing, rejoices over the offer of the first golden grain. Donal dropped on his knees and prayed. "O Father of us all," he said, "in whose hands are these unruly hearts of ours? We cannot manage ourselves. We ruin our own selves, but in thee is our help found." Prayer went from him. He rose from his knees. "Go on, go on! Don't stop!" cried the earl. "He may hear you, who can tell?" Donal went down on his knees again. "O God," he said, "thou knowest us, whether we speak to thee or not. Take from this man his hardness of heart. Make him love thee." There he stopped again. He could say no more. "I can't pray, my lord," he said, rising. "I don't know why. It seems as if nothing I said meant anything. I will pray for you when I am alone." "Are there so many devils about me that an honest fellow can't pray in my company?" cried the earl. "I will pray myself, in spite of the whole swarm of them, big and little. O God, save me! I don't want to be damned. I will be good if thou wilt make me. I don't care about it myself, but thou canst do as thou pleasest. It would be a fine thing if a rascal like me were to escape the devil through thy goodness after all. I'm worth nothing, but there's my wife. Pray, pray, Lord God, let me one day see my wife again. For Christ's sake. Ain't that the way, Grant? Amen." Donal had dropped on his knees once more when the earl began to pray. He uttered a hearty Amen. The earl turned sharply towards him, and saw he was weeping. He put out his hand to him, and said, "You'll stand my friend, Grant?" End of chapter 79. Chapter 80 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 80. A Wayfaring. Suddenly, what strength Lady Arctura had gave way, and she began to sink. But it was spring, with the summer at hand. They hoped she would recover sufficiently to be removed to a fitter climate. She did not herself think so. She had hardly a doubt that her time was come. She was calm, often cheerful, but her spirits were variable. Donal's heart was sorer than he had thought it could be again. One day, having been reading a little to her, he sat looking at her. He did not know how sad was the expression of his countenance. She looked up, smiled, and said, "You think I am unhappy. You could not look at me like that if you did not think so. I am only tired. I am not unhappy. I hardly know now what unhappiness is. If ever I look as if I were unhappy, it is only that I am waiting for more life. It is on the way. I feel it is, because I am so content with everything. I would have nothing other than it is. It is very hard for God that his children will not trust him to do with them what he pleases. I am sure, Mr. Grant, the world is all wrong, and on the way to be all wondrously right. It will cost God much labour yet. We will cost him as little as we can, won't we? Oh, Mr. Grant, if it hadn't been for you, God would have been far away still. For a God I should have had something half an idol, half a commonplace tyrant. I should never have dreamed of the glory of God." "No, my lady," returned Donal. "If God had not sent me, he would have sent somebody else. You were ready. I am very glad he sent you. I should never have loved any other so much." Donal's eyes filled with tears. He was simple as a child. No male vanity, no self-exaltation that a woman should love him and tell him she loved him sprang up in his heart. He knew she loved him. He loved her. All was so natural it could not be otherwise. He never presumed to imagine her once thinking of him as he had thought of Ginevra. He was her servant, willing and loving as any angel of God. That was all, and enough. "You are not vexed with your pupil, are you?" she resumed, again looking up in his face, this time with a rosy flush on her own. "Why?" said Donal, with wonder. "For speaking so to my master." "Angry because you love me?" "No, of course," she responded, at once satisfied. "You knew that must be. How could I but love you? Better than anyone else in the world. You have given me life. I was dead. You have been like another father to me," she added, with a smile of heavenly tenderness. "But I could not have spoken to you like this if I had not known I was dying." The word shot a sting as of fire through Donal's heart. "You were always a child, Mr. Grant," she went on. "Death is making a child of me. It makes us all children. As if we were two little children together, I tell you I love you. Don't look like that," she continued. "You must not forget what you have been teaching me all this time, that the will of God, the perfect God, is all in all. He is not a God far off. To know that is enough to have lived for. You have taught me that, and I love you with a true heart fervently." Donal could not speak. He knew she was dying. "Mr. Grant," she began again, "my soul is open to his eyes, and is not ashamed. I know I am going to do what would by the world be counted unwomanly. But you and I stand before our Father, not before the world. I ask you in plain words, knowing that if you cannot do as I ask you willingly, you will not do it. And be sure I shall plainly be dying before I claim the fulfilment of your promise, if you give it. I do not want your answer all at once. You must think about it." Here she paused a while, then said, "I want you to marry me, if you will, before I go." Donal could not yet speak. His soul was in a tumult of emotion. "I am tired," she said. "Please go and think it over. If you say no, I shall only say, he knows best what is best. I shall not be ashamed. Only you must not once think what the world would say. Of all people we have nothing to do with the world. We have nothing to do but with God and love. If he be pleased with us, we can afford to smile at what his silly children think of us. They mind only what their vulgar nurses say, not what their perfect Father says. We need not mind them, need we? I wonder at myself," she went on, for Donal did not utter a word, "for being able to speak like this, but then I have been thinking of it for a long time, chiefly as I lie awake. I am never afraid now, not though I lie awake all night. Perfect love casteth out fear, you know. I have God to love, and Jesus to love, and you to love, and my own Father to love. When you know him, you will see how good a man can be without having been brought up like you. Oh, Donal, do say something, or I shall cry, and crying kills me." She was sitting on a low chair, with the sunlight across her lap, for she was again in the sunny Garland room, and the firelight on her face. Donal knelt gently down, and laid his hands in the sunlight on her lap, just as if he were going to say his prayers at his mother's knee. She laid both her hands on his. "I have something to tell you," he said, "and then you must speak again." "Tell me," said Arctura, with a little gasp. "When I came here," said Donal, "I thought my heart so broken that it would never love, that way I mean, any more. But I loved God better than ever, and as one I would fain help, I loved you from the very first. But I should have scorned myself had I once fancied you loved me more than just to do anything for me I needed done. When I saw you troubled, I longed to take you up in my arms, and carry you like a lovely bird that had fallen from one of God's nests. But never once, my lady, did I think of your caring for my love. It was yours as a matter of course. I once asked a lady to kiss me, just once, for a good-bye. She would not, and she was quite right, but after that I never spoke to a lady but she seemed to stand far away on the top of a hill against a sky." He stopped. Her hands on his fluttered a little, as if they would fly. "Is she alive?" she asked. "Oh yes, my lady." "Then she may change," said Arctura, and stopped, for there was a stone in her heart. Donal laughed. It was an odd laugh, but it did Arctura good. "No danger of that, my lady. She has the best husband in the world, a much better than I should have made, much as I loved her." "That can't be." "Why, my lady, her husband's Sir Gibbie. She's Lady Galbraith. I would never have wished her mine if I had known she loved Gibbie. I love her next to him." Then. "What, my lady?" Then, oh, do say something." "What should I say? What God wills is fast as the roots of the universe, and lovely as its blossom." Arctura burst into tears. "Then you do not care for me?" Donal began to understand. In some things he went on so fast that he could not hear the cry behind him. She had spoken, and had been listening in vain for response. She thought herself unloved. He had shown her no sign that he loved her. His heart was so full of love and the joy of love that they had made him very still. Now the delight of love awoke. He took her in his arms like a child, rose, and went walking about the room with her, petting and soothing her. He held her close to his heart. Her head was on his shoulder, and his face was turned to hers. "I love you," he said, "and love you to all eternity. I have love enough now to live upon if you should die tonight, and I should tarry till he come. O God, thou art too good to me. It is more than my heart can bear. To make men and women, and give them to each other, and not be one moment jealous of the love wherewith they love one another, is to be a God indeed." So said Donal, and spoke the high truth. But alas for the love wherewith men and women love each other! There were small room for God to be jealous of that. It is the little love with which they love each other, the great love with which they love themselves, that hurts the heart of their Father. Arctura signed at length a prayer for release, and he set her gently down in her chair again. Then he saw her face more beautiful than ever before, and the rose that bloomed there was the rose of a health deeper than sickness. These children of God were of the blessed few who love the more that they know him present, whose souls are naked before him, and not ashamed. Let him that hears understand. If he understand not, let him hold his peace, and it will be his wisdom. He who has no place for this love in his religion, who thinks to be more holy without it, is not of God's mind when he said, "Let us make man." He may be a saint, but he cannot be a man after God's own heart. The finished man is the saved man. The saint may have to be saved from more than sin. "When shall we be married?" asked Donal. "Soon." "Soon," answered Arctura. "To-morrow, then?" "No, not to-morrow. There is no such haste, now that we understand each other," she added with a rosy smile. "I want to be married to you before I die, that is all. Not just to-morrow, or the next day." "When you please, my love," said Donal. She laid her head on his bosom. "We are as good as married now," she said. "We know that each loves the other. How I shall wait for you! You will be mine, you know, a little bit mine, won't you? Even if you should marry some beautiful lady after I am gone. I shall love her when she comes." Arctura, said Donal. End of chapter 80. Chapter 81 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 81. A Will and a Wedding. But the opening of the windows of heaven, and the unspeakable rush of life through channels too narrow and banks too weak to hold its tide, caused a terrible inundation. The red flood broke its banks, and weakened all the land. Arctura sent for Mr. Graeme, and commissioned him to fetch the family lawyer from Edinburgh. Alone with him she gave instructions concerning her will. The man of business shrugged his shoulders, laden with so many petty weights, bowed down with so many falsest opinions, and would have expostulated with her. "Sir," she said. "You have a cousin who inherits the title," he suggested. "Mr. Fortune," she returned, "it may be I know as much of my family as you. I did not send for you to consult you, but to tell you how I would have my will drawn up." "I beg your pardon, my lady," rejoined the lawyer, "but there are things which may make it one's duty to speak out." "Speak then. I will listen, that you may ease your mind." He began a long, common sense, worldly talk on the matter, nor once repeated himself. When he stopped, "Now have you eased your mind?" she asked. "I have, my lady." "Then listen to me. There is no necessity you should hurt either your feelings or your prejudices. If it goes against your conscience to do as I wish, I will not trouble you." Mr. Fortune bowed, took his instructions, and rose. "When will you bring it me?" she asked. "In the course of a week or two, my lady." "If it is not in my hands by the day after to-morrow, I will send for a gentleman from the town to prepare it." "You shall have it, my lady," said Mr. Fortune. She did have it, and it was signed and witnessed. Then she sank more rapidly. Donal said no word about the marriage. It should be as she pleased. He was much by her bedside, reading to her when she was able to listen, talking to her or sitting silent when she was not. Arctura had at once told Mistress Brookes the relation in which she and Donal stood to each other. It cost the good woman many tears, for she thought such a love one of the saddest things in a sad world. Neither Arctura nor Donal thought so. The earl at this time was a little better, though without prospect of even temporary recovery. He had grown much gentler, and sadness had partially displaced his sullenness. He seemed to have become in a measure aware of the bruteness of the life he had hitherto led. He must have had a glimpse of something better. It is wonderful what the sickness which human stupidity regards as the one evil thing can do towards redemption. He showed concern at his niece's illness, and had himself carried down every other day to see her for a few minutes. She received him always with the greatest gentleness, and he showed something that seemed like genuine affection for her. It was a morning in the month of May. The naked twigs were shivering all for cold, when Donal, who had been with Arctura the greater part of the night, and now lay on the couch in a neighbouring room, heard Mrs. Brookes call him. "My lady wants you, sir," she said. He started up and went to her. "Send for the minister," she whispered. "Not Mr. Carmichael. He does not know you. Send for Mr. Graeme too. He and Mistress Brookes will be witnesses. I must call you husband once before I die." "I hope you will many a time after," he returned. She smiled on him with a look of love unutterable. "Mind," she said, holding out her arms feebly, but drawing him fast to her bosom, "that this is how I love you. When you see me dull and stupid, and I hardly look at you, for though death makes bright, dying makes stupid, then say to yourself, 'This is not how she loves me, it is only how she is dying. She loves me and knows it, and by will be able to show it.'" They were precious words, both then and afterwards. With some careful questioning, to satisfy himself that, so evidently at the gate of death, she yet knew perfectly her own mind, and not without some shakes of the head revealing disapprobation, the minister did as he was requested, and wrote a certificate of the fact, which was duly signed and witnessed. And if he showed his disapproval yet more in the prayer with which he concluded the ceremony, none but Mistress Brookes showed responsive indignation. The bridegroom gave his bride one gentle kiss, and withdrew with the clergyman. "Pardon me if I characterize this as a strange proceeding," said the latter. "Not so strange perhaps as it looks, sir," said Donal. "On the very brink of the other world. The other world and its brink too are his who ordained marriage." "For this world only," said the minister. "The gifts of God are without repentance," said Donal. "I have heard of you," returned the clergyman. "You are one, they tell me, given to misusing scripture." He had conceived a painful doubt that he had been drawn into some plot. "Sir," said Donal sternly, "if you saw any impropriety in the ceremony, why did you perform it? I beg you will now reserve your remarks. You ought to have made them before, or not at all. If you be silent, the thing will probably never be heard of, and I should greatly dislike having it the town talk." "Except I see reason, that is, if nothing follow to render disclosure necessary, I shall be silent," said the minister. He would have declined the fee offered by Donal, but he was poor, and its amount prevailed. He accepted it, and took his leave with a stiffness he intended for dignity. He had a high sense, if not of the dignity of his office, at least of the dignity his office conferred on him. Donal had next a brief interview with Mr. Graeme. The factor was in a state of utter bewilderment, and readily yielded Donal a promise of silence. The mere whim of a dying girl, it had better be ignored and forgotten. As to Grant's part in it, he did not know what to think. It could not affect the property, he thought. It could hardly be a marriage. And then there was the will, of the contents of which he knew nothing. If it were a complete marriage, the will was worth nothing, being made before it. I will not linger over the quiet, sad time that followed. Donal was to Arctura, she said, father, brother, husband in one. Through him she had reaped the harvest of the world, in spite of falsehood, murder, fear, and distrust. She lay victorious on the battlefield. In the heart of her bridegroom reigned a peace the world could not give or take away. He loved with a love that cast the love of former days into the shadow of a sweet but undesired remembrance. A long twilight life lay before him, but he would have plenty to do, and such was the love between him and Arctura, that every doing of the will of God was as the tying of a fresh bond between him and her. She was his because they were the Father's, whose will was the life and bond of the universe. "I think," said Donal, that same night by her bed, "when my mother dies, she will go near you. I will, if I can, send you a message by her. But it will not matter. It can only tell you what you will know well enough, that I love you, and am waiting to come to you." The stupidity of calling oneself a Christian, and doubting if we shall know our friends hereafter! In those who do not believe, such a doubt is more than natural, but in those who profess to believe, it shows what a ragged scarecrow is the thing they call their faith, not worth that of many an old Jew, or that of here and there a pagan. "I shall not be far from you, dear, I think, sometimes at least," she said, speaking very low. "If you dream anything nice about me, think I am thinking of you. If you should dream anything not nice, think something is lying to you about me. I do not know if I shall be allowed to come near you, but if I am, and I think I shall be, sometimes I shall laugh to myself to think how near I am, and you fancying me a long way off. But anyway, all will be well, for the great life, our God, our Father is, and in him we cannot but be together." After that she fell into a deep sleep, and slept for hours. Then suddenly she sat up. Donal put his arm behind and supported her. She looked a little wild, shuddered, murmured something he could not understand, then threw herself back into his arms. Her expression changed to a look of divinest, loveliest content, and she was gone. End of chapter 81. Chapter 82 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant by George MacDonald. Chapter 82. The Will. When her will was read, it was found that, except some legacies and an annuity to Mrs. Brookes, she had left everything to Donal. Mr. Graeme, rising the moment the lawyer looked up, congratulated Donal politely, not cordially, and took his leave. "If you are walking towards home," said Donal, "I will walk with you." "I shall be happy," said Mr. Graeme, feeling it not a little hard that one who would soon be heir presumptive to the title should have to tend the family property in the service of a stranger and a peasant. "Lord Morven cannot live long," said Donal as they went. "It is not to be wished he should." Mr. Graeme returned no answer. Donal resumed. "I think I ought to let you know at once that you are heir to the title." "I think you owe the knowledge to myself," said the factor, not without a touch of contempt. "By no means," rejoined Donal. "On presumption after lord Forgue, you told me. After lord Morven, I tell you." "I am at a loss to imagine on what you found such a statement," said Graeme, beginning to suspect insanity. "Naturally, no one knows it but myself. Lord Morven knows that his son cannot succeed, but he does not know that you can. I am prepared, if not to prove, at least to convince you that he and his son's mother were not married." Mr. Graeme was for a moment silent. Then he laughed a little laugh, not a pleasant one. "Another of Time's clownish tricks," he said to himself. "The earl the factor on the family estate!" Donal did not like the way he took it, but saw how natural it was. "I hope you have known me long enough," he said, "to believe I have contrived nothing." "Excuse me, Mr. Grant, the whole business looks suspicious. The girl was dying. You knew it." "I do not understand you." "What did you marry her for?" "To make her my wife." "Pray what could be the good of that, except—" "Does it need any explanation but that we loved each other?" "You will find it difficult to convince the world that such was your sole motive." "Having no care for the opinion of the world, I shall be satisfied if I convince you. The world needs never hear of the thing. Would you, Mr. Graeme, have had me not marry her, because the world, including not a few honest men like yourself, would say my object was the property?" "Don't put the question to me. I am not the proper person to answer it. There is not a man in 100 millions who with the chance would not have done the same, or whom all the rest would not blame for doing it. It would have been better for you, however, that there had been no will." "How?" "It makes it look the more like a scheme. The will might have been disputed." "Why do you say might have been?" "Because it is not worth disputing now. If the marriage stands, it annuls the will." "I did not know. And I suppose she did not know either. Or perhaps she wanted to make the thing sure. If the marriage was not enough, the will would be, she may have thought. But I knew nothing of it." "You did not?" "Of course I did not." Mr. Graeme held his peace. For the first time he doubted Donal's word. "But I wanted to have a little talk with you," resumed Donal. "I want to know whether you think your duty all to the owner of the land, or in any measure to the tenants also." "That is easy to answer. One employed by the landlord can owe the tenant nothing." It was not just the answer he would have given to another questioner. "Do you not owe him justice?" asked Donal. "Every legal advantage I ought to take from my employer." "Even to the grinding of the faces of the poor?" "I have nothing to do, as his employee, with my own ideas as to what may be equitable." He drew the line thus hard in pure opposition to Donal. "What then would you say if the land were your own? Would you say you had it solely for your own and your family's good, or for that of the tenants as well?" "I should very likely reason that what was good for them would in the long run be good for me too. But if you want to know how I have treated the tenants, there are intelligent men amongst them, not at all prejudiced in favour of the factor." "I wish you would be open with me," said Donal. "I prefer keeping my own place," rejoined Mr. Graeme. "You speak as one who found a change in me," returned Donal. "There is none." So saying, he shook hands with him, bade him good morning, and turned with the depression of failure. "I did not lead up to the point properly," he said to himself. End of chapter 82. Chapter 83 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 83. Insight. Mr. Graeme was a good sort of man, and a gentleman, but he was not capable of meeting Donal on the ground on which he approached him. On that level he had never set foot. There is nothing more disappointing to the generous man than the way in which his absolute frankness is met by the man of the world, always looking out for motives, and imagining them after what is in himself. There was great confidence between the brother and sister, and as he walked homeward, Mr. Graeme was not so well pleased with himself as to think with satisfaction on the report of the interview he could give Kate. He did not accuse himself with regard to anything he had said, but he felt his behaviour influenced by jealousy of the low-born youth who had supplanted him. For if Percy could not succeed to the title, neither could he have succeeded to the property, and but for the will or the marriage, perhaps but for the two together, he would himself have come in for that also. The will was worth nothing except the marriage was disputed. Annul the marriage, and the will was of force. He told his sister, as nearly as he could, all that had passed between them. "If he wanted me to talk to him," he said, "why did he tell me that about Forgue? It was infernally stupid of him. But what's bred in the bone? A gentleman's not made in a day." "Nor in 1,000 years, Hector," rejoined his sister. "Donal Grant is a gentleman in the best sense of the word. That you say he is not, lets me see you are vexed with yourself. He is a little awkward sometimes, I confess, but only when he is looking at a thing from some other point of view, and does not like to say you ought to have been looking at it from the same. And you can't say he shuffles, for he never stops till he has done his best to make you. What have you been saying to him, Hector?" "Nothing but what I have told you. It's rather what I have not been saying," answered her brother. "He would have had me open out to him, and I wouldn't. How could I? Whatever I said that pleased him would have looked as if I wanted to secure my situation. Hang it all, I have a good mind to throw it up. How is a Graeme to serve under a bumpkin?" "The man is not a bumpkin, he is a scholar and a poet," said the lady. "Pooh, pooh! What's a poet?" "One that may or may not be as good a man of business as yourself when it is required of him." "Come, come, don't you turn against me, Kate. It's hard enough to bear as it is." Miss Graeme made no reply. She was meditating all she knew of Donal, to guide her to the something to which she was sure her brother had not let him come. And presently she made him recount again all they had said to each other. "I tell you, Hector," she exclaimed, "you never made such a fool of yourself in your life. If I know human nature, that man is different from any other you have had to do with. It will take a woman, a better woman than your sister, I confess, to understand him, but I see a little farther into him than you do. He is a man who, never having had money enough to learn the bad uses of it, and never having formed habits it takes money to supply, having no ambition, living in books not in places, and for pleasure having more at his command in himself than the richest, he is a man who, I say, would find money an impediment to his happiness, for he must have a sense of duty with regard to it which would interfere with everything he liked best. Besides, though he does not care a straw for the judgment of the world where it differs from him, he would be sorry to seem to go against that judgment where he agrees with it. Scorning to marry any woman for her money, he would not have the world think he had done so." "Ah, Katie, there I have you! The world would entirely approve of his doing that." "I will take a better position then. He would not willingly seem to have done a thing he himself despises. The man believes himself sent into the world to teach it something. He would not have it thrown in his teeth that after all he looks to the main chance as keenly as another. He would starve before he would have men say so, yes, even say so falsely. I am as sure he did not marry Lady Arctura for her money, as I am sure Lord Forgue, or you, Hector, would have done it if you had had a chance. There! My conviction is that the bumpkin sought a fit opening to tell you that the will was to go for nothing, and that no word need be said about the marriage. You know he made you promise not to mention it, only I wormed it out of you." "That's just like you women. The man you take a fancy to is always head and shoulders above other men." "As you take it so, I will tell you more. That man will never marry again." "Wait a bit. Admiration is sometimes mutual. Who knows but he may ask you next?" "If he did ask me, I might take him, but I should never think so much of him." "Heroic Kate!" "If you had been a little more heroic, Hector, you would have responded to him, and found it considerably to your advantage." "You don't imagine I would be indebted—" "Hush, hush! Don't pledge yourself in a hurry, even to me," said Kate. "Leave as wide a sea margin about your boat as you may. You don't know what you would or would not. Mr. Grant knows, but you do not." "Mr. Grant again! Well!" "Well, we shall see." And they soon did, for that same evening Donal called, and asked to see Miss Graeme. "I am sorry my brother is gone down to the town," she said. "It was you I wanted to see," he answered. "I wish to speak openly to you, for I imagine you will understand me better than your brother. Perhaps I ought rather to say, I shall be better able to explain myself to you." There was that in his countenance which seemed to seize and hold her. A calm exultation, as of a man who had outlived weakness, and was facing the eternal. The spirit of a smile hovered about his mouth and eyes, embodying itself now and then in a grave, sweet, satisfied smile. The man seemed full of content, not with himself, but with something he would gladly share. "I have been talking with your brother," he said, after a brief pause. "I know," she answered. "I am afraid he did not meet you as he ought. He is a good and honourable man, but like most men he needs a moment to pull himself together. Few men, Mr. Grant, when suddenly called upon, answer from the best that is in them." "The fact is simply this," resumed Donal: "I do not want the Morven property. I thank God for Lady Arctura. What was hers I do not desire." "But may it not be your duty to take it, Mr. Grant? Pardon me for suggesting duty to one who always acts from it. I have reflected, and do not think God wants me to take it. Because she is mine, ought I of necessity to be enslaved to all her accidents? Must I, because I love her, hoard her gowns and shoes?" Then first Miss Graeme noted that he never spoke of his wife as in the past. "But there are others to be considered," she replied. "You have made me think about many things, Mr. Grant. My brother and I have had many talks as to what we would do if the land were ours." "And yours it shall be," said Donal, "if you will take it as a trust for the good of all whom it supports. I have other work to do." "I will tell my brother what you say," answered Miss Graeme, with victory in her heart, for was it not as she had divined? "It is better," continued Donal, "to help make good men than happy tenants. Besides, I know how to do the one, and I do not know how to do the other. There would always be a prejudice against me too, as not to the manner born. But if your brother should accept my offer, I hope he will not think me interfering if I talk sometimes of the principles of the relation. Things go wrong generally, because men have such absurd and impossible notions about possession. They call things their own which it is impossible from their very nature ever to possess or make their own. Power was never given to man over men for his own sake, and the nearer he that so uses it comes to success, the more utter will prove his discomfiture. Talk to your brother about it, Miss Graeme. Tell him that, as heir to the title, and as head of the family, he can do more than any other with the property, and I will gladly make it over to him without reserve. I would not be even partially turned aside from my own calling." "I will tell him what you say. I told him he had misunderstood you. I saw into your generous thought." "It is not generous at all. My dear Miss Graeme, you do not know how little of a temptation such things are to me. There are some who only care to inherit straight from the first father. You may say the earth is the Lord's, and therefore a part of that first inheritance. I admit it, but such possession as this in question would not satisfy me in the least. I must inherit the earth in a far deeper, grander, truer way than calling the land mine, before I shall count myself to have come into my own. I want to have all things just as the maker of me wants me to have them. I will call on you again to morrow. I must now go back to the earl. Poor man, he is sinking fast. But I believe he is more at peace than he has ever been before." Donal took his leave, and Miss Graeme had plenty to think of till her brother's return. If she felt a little triumphant, it may be pardoned her. He was ashamed, and not a little humbled by what she told him. He did not wait for Donal to come to him, but went to the castle early the next morning. Nor was he mistaken in trusting Donal to believe that it was not from eagerness to retrace in his own interest the false step he had taken, but from desire to show his shame of having behaved so ungenerously. Donal received him so as to make it plain he did not misunderstand him, and they had a long talk. Graeme was all the readier for his blunder to hear what Donal had to say, and Donal's unquestionable disinterestedness was endlessly potent with Graeme. Their interview resulted in Donal's thinking still better of him than before, and being satisfied that, up to his light, the man was honest, which is saying much, and thence open to conviction and both sides of a question. But ere it was naturally over, Donal was summoned to the earl. After his niece's death, no one would do for him but Donal. Nobody could please him but Donal. His mind as well as his body was much weaker. But the intellect, great thing though it be, is yet but the soil out of which, or rather in which, higher things must grow. And it is well when that soil is not too strong, so to speak, for the most gracious and lovely of plants to root themselves in it. When the said soil is proud and unwilling to serve, it must be thinned and pulverized with sickness, failure, poverty, fear, that the good seeds of God's garden may be able to root themselves in it. When they get up a little, they will use all the riches and all the strength of the stiffest soil. "Who will have the property now?" he asked one day. "Is the factor anywhere in the running?" "Title and property both will be his," answered Donal. "And my poor Davie?" said the earl, with wistful question in the eyes that gazed up in Donal's face. "Forgue, the rascal, has all my money in his power already." "I will see to Davie," replied Donal. "When you and I meet, my lord, by and by, I shall not be ashamed." The poor man was satisfied. He sent for Davie, and told him he was always to do as Mr. Grant wished, that he left him in his charge, and that he must behave to him like a son. Davie was fast making acquaintance with death, but it was not to him dreadful as to most children, for he saw it through the face and the words of the man whom he most honoured. End of chapter 83. Chapter 84 of Donal Grant. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devorah Allen. Donal Grant, by George MacDonald. Chapter 84. Morven House. In the evening, Donal went again to the home farm. Finding himself alone in the drawing-room, he walked out into the old garden. "Thank God," he said to himself, "if my wife should come here some sad, sweet night, with a low moon crescent and a gently thinking wind, and wander about the garden, it will not be to know herself forgotten." He went up and down the grassy paths. Once again, all as long ago, for it seemed long now, he was joined by Miss Graeme. "I couldn't help fancying," she said, as she came up to him, "that I saw Lady Arctura walking by your side. God forgive me, how could I be so heartless as mention her?" "Her name will always be pleasant in my ears," returned Donal. "I was thinking of her. That was how you felt as if you saw her. You did not really see anything, did you?" "Oh, no." "She is nearer me than that," said Donal. "She will be with me wherever I am. I shall never be sad. God is with me, and I do not weep that I cannot see him. I wait. I wait." Miss Graeme was in tears. "Mr. Grant," she said, "she is gone a happy angel to heaven instead of a pining woman. That is your doing. God bless you. You will let me think of you as a friend?" "Always, always. You loved her." "I did not at first. I thought of her only as a poor troubled creature. Now I know there was more life in her trouble than in my content. I came not only to love her, but to look up to her as a saint. If ever there was one, it was she, Mr. Grant. She often came here after I showed her that poem. She used to walk here alone in the twilight. That horrid Miss Carmichael, she was the plague of her life. She was God's messenger, to buffet her and make her know her need of him. Be sure, Miss Graeme, not a soul can do without him." Here Mr. Graeme joined them. "I do not think the earl will last many days," said Donal. "It would be well, it seems to me, at once upon his death to take possession of the house and the town. It is the only property that goes with the title. And of course you would at once take up your abode in the castle. You will find in the earl's papers many proofs, I imagine, that his son has no claim. I would have a deed of gift drawn up, but would rather you seemed to come in by natural succession. We are not bound to tell the world everything. We are only bound to be able without shame to tell it everything. And then I shall have a favour to ask. Morven House, down in the town, is of no great use to you. Let me rent it of you. I should like to live there, and have a school, with Davy for my first pupil. When we get another, we will try to make a man of him too. We will not care so much about making a great scholar, or a great anything of him, but a true man. We will try to help the whole man of him into the likeness of the one man." Here Mr. Graeme broke in. "You will never make a living that way," he said. Donal opened his eyes and looked at him. Like one convicted and ashamed, the eyes of the man of business fell before those of the man of God. "Ah," said Donal, "you have not an idea, Mr. Graeme, on how little I could live. Here, you had better take the will," he added, pulling it from his pocket. Mr. Graeme hesitated. "If you would rather not, I will keep it. I would throw it in the fire, but either you or I must keep it for a time as against all chances." Mr. Graeme took it. That night the earl died. Donal wrote to Percy that his father was dead. 2 days after he appeared. The new earl met him in the hall. "Mr. Graeme," said Percy. "I am Lord Morven, Mr. Graeme," returned his lordship. The fellow said an evil word, turned on his heel, and left them to bury his father without him. The funeral over, the earl turned to Donal and looked him in the face. They walked back to the castle arm in arm, and from that moment were as brothers. Earl Hector did nothing of importance without consulting Donal, and Donal had the more influence both with landlord and tenants that he had no interest in the property. The same week he left the castle, and took possession of Morven House. The people said Mr. Grant had played his cards well. Had they known what he had really done, they would have called him a born idiot. Davy, to whom no calamity could be overwhelming so long as he had Mr. Grant, accompanied him gladly, more than content to live with him till he went to college, whither the earl wished to send him. Donal hindered rather than sped the day. When it came, the earl would have had him go too, but Donal would not. "I have done what I can," he said. "It is time he should walk alone." It was soon evident that the boy would not disgrace him. There is no certainty as to how deep any teaching may have gone, as to whether it has reached the issues of life or not, until a youth is left by himself, and has to choose and refuse companions. The most promising youths are often but promisers. With the full concurrence of Miss Graeme, Donal had persuaded Mistress Brookes, easy persuasion where the suggestion was enough, to keep house for him. They went together, and together unlocked the door of Morven House. Mistress Brookes said the place was in an awful state. There was not much, to be sure, for the mason to do, but for the carpenter, it had not been touched for generations. He must go away, and stay away till she summoned him. Donal gladly went home to his hills, and took Davy with him. He told his father and mother, Sir Gibbie and his lady, the things that had befallen him, and every one approved heartily of what he had done. His mother took his renunciation of the property as a matter of course. All agreed it should not be spoken of. When they returned to Auchars, Sir Gibbie and Lady Galbraith went with them, and stayed for some weeks. The townsfolk said he was but a poor baronet that could not speak mortal word. Lord Morven and Miss Graeme had done their best to make the house what they thought Donal would like, but in the castle they kept for him the rooms Lady Arctura had called her own. There he gathered the books, and a few other of the more immediately personal possessions of his wife, her piano for one, upon which he taught himself to play a little, and thither he betook himself often on holidays, and always on Sunday evenings. What went on then I leave to the imagination of the reader who knows that alone one may meet many, sitting still may travel far, and silent make the universe hear. Lord Morven kept Larky for Davy. The last I heard of Davy was that he was in India, an officer in the army, beloved of his men, and exercising a most beneficial influence on his regiment. The things he had learned, he had so learned that they went out from him, finding new ground in which to root and grow. In his day and generation he helped the coming of the kingdom of truth and righteousness, and so fulfilled his high calling. It was some time before Donal had any pupils, and he never had many, for he was regarded as a most peculiar man, with ideas about education odd in the extreme. It was granted, however, that if a boy stayed, or rather if he allowed him to stay with him long enough, he was sure to turn out a gentleman. That which was deeper and was the life of the gentleman, people seldom saw, would seldom have valued if they had seen. Most parents would like their children to be ladies and gentlemen. That they should be sons and daughters of God, they do not care. The few wise souls in the neighbourhood know Donal as the heart of the place, the man to go to in any difficulty, in any trouble or apprehension. Miss Carmichael grew by degrees less talkative, and less obtrusive of her opinions. After some years she condescended to marry a farmer on Lord Morven's estate. Their only child, a thoughtful boy, and a true reader, sought the company of the grave man with the sweet smile, going often to his house to ask him about this or that. He reminded him of Davy, and grew very dear to him. The mother discovering that, as often as he stole away, it was to go to the master, everybody called him the maester, scolded and forbade. But the prohibition brought such a time of tears and gloom and loss of appetite, and her husband so little shared her prejudices against the master, that she was compelled to recall it, and the boy went and went as before. When he was taken ill, and on his death-bed, nobody could make him happy but the master. He almost nursed him through the last few days of his short earthly life. But the mother seemed not to like him any the better, rather to regard him as having deprived her of some of her rights in the love of her boy. Donal is still a present power of heat and light in the town of Auchars. He wears the same solemn look, the same hovering smile. They say to those who can read them, "I know in whom I have believed." It is the God who is the Father of the Lord that he believes in. His life is hid with Christ in God, and he has no anxiety about anything. The wheels of the coming chariot, moving fast or slow to fetch him, are always moving, and whether it arrive at night, or at cock-crowing, or in the blaze of noon, is one to him. He is ready for the life his Arctura knows. God is, he says, and all is well. He never disputes, rarely seeks to convince. I will let what light I have shine, but disputation is smoke, it is to no profit. And I do like, he says, to give and to get the good of things. End of chapter 84. The End of Donal Grant by George MacDonald.